Welcome to the Back to Health podcast, where we share inspirational stories of hope to help you reclaim your health. If you're suffering from a chronic condition and have been given little to no hope, if you've been told that there's nothing wrong with you, but you know there definitely is something wrong, or if you're just trying to be preventative and want to know how to reclaim your health, then this podcast is for you. I can't wait to share today's episode. Welcome to the Back to Health podcast. My name is Rashani Mahendran, and today we are talking about overcoming anxiety. Now, given the events of the last year, more people than ever before are dealing with anxiety, including our children. So my guest today is an anxiety specialist, Shane, and he uses somatic therapies to heal trauma and help people enjoy life without anxiety getting in the way. He also talks to us about fear and the part that fear plays on the brain in stopping our executive functioning skills like decision making and critical thinking. This is an episode you're not going to want to miss. Enjoy. Hi, Shane. Welcome to the show, and thank you so much for making the time to speak today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Shane, I know your area of expertise is obviously anxiety, which is a big topic and theme over the last year. So, even people who maybe were not as familiar with anxiety or didn't really look at mental health as being something that was like, a focus for them, it's come to light for all of us in this last year. No matter how strong you might think you are or how well you might think you've coped, mental health and anxiety obviously play a huge part. So, I think I'd love to dive into sort of what are the trends and changes, because you've been in this line of work for a while, and what changes have you seen in the last year around anxiety in particular?
Well, a lot of people who have never experienced anxiety are noticing that they're starting to experience anxiety, or a lot of old sort of traumas and stuff are starting to surface. A lot of old kind of memories are sort of coming up to the surface. A lot of people are noticing that, especially where we've had lockdowns, we've not had the ability to meet our friends, co-regulate, do our normal activities of how we kind of release stress. A lot of people have been struggling with the buildup of stress, and a lot of people have just been suffering from anxiety in general, which they've never experienced before. I mean, my own personal experience, I had pretty much anxiety my whole life without even recognizing what anxiety was. It wasn't even until I had kind of panic attacks where I was going to A&E thinking I was having a heart attack, thinking I was dying. And it was only then that they was like, "I know you're experiencing anxiety, you experience panic attacks." So most people have no idea what anxiety even is. A lot of times I used to, in the past, think that you'd have to be a certain kind of person. You'd have to be kind of like these kind of crazy people, like schizophrenic or something. Like that's what I thought mental health was. But the reality was, my whole life, I've pretty much experienced some level of anxiety.
Yeah, and for people who aren't familiar or don't really know how to recognize the signs, could you talk us through like what some of the signs be? Because there can be a spectrum of signs. There can be very little things to very obvious things like panic attacks that you mentioned. So maybe you can talk us through that.
So, anxiety is a symptom essentially of a dysregulated nerve system. So, this is where we have too much activity of our sympathetic nerve system and not enough activity in our parasympathetic nerve system. So, our sympathetic nerve system is essentially kind of like our mobilization. So, we need some mobilization just on a day-to-day basis. Say, for example, if you woke up in the morning, if you had no stress, you just not want to do anything and not move. So, stress is good. Stress isn't necessarily a bad thing, but when stress levels increase too high, we end up going into a fight or flight response. This is a survival response. This is where we may have ruminating thoughts. We may have certain thoughts over and over again. We typically feel a negative kind of impact. So, because our mind is wired for survival, if we are in that sympathetic state or in that kind of survival response or in detecting danger, our mind is framed to look out for the worst because that's what we're built to do. So if you're finding it hard, the biggest signs is finding it hard to enjoy life, finding it hard to actually switch off, being really sort of super busy. These are all kind of like subtle effects. A lot of times people think that you're kind of like having to have like super crazy anxious thoughts and you're losing your mind. Like that can be a part of it, but most of it, a lot of people have very high functioning anxiety. For a lot of my life, I had high functioning anxiety. I've been a bit of a perfectionist. I've always performed well. I've been quite go, go, go. I've always had a lot of kind of things or projects that I've been working on. But a lot of times, you can have the psychological effects and you can also have the physiological effects as well. So you can have things like sort of trembling, high heart rate, an irregular sort of heartbeat. But most of the stuff that we kind of, it literally impacts everything in your body, from heart rate to digestion. Some people suffer with IBS. Some people suffer from, say, for example, depression, which is when our nervous system has been activated for too long. And if our nervous system is activated for too long and nothing's being done, we end up going into a freeze response, which is where people experience a lot of chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, a lot of these chronic health conditions is actually a result of just too much stored stress in the nervous system.
Yeah, and I think I can relate to this because in periods of high stress, I tend to go into over functioning. Like I become high functioning. I'll start to look for other things I can take on to keep myself busy and distracted and try and find ways to take that energy and put it into something else so that you're not having to or almost like avoid it, maybe avoiding the stress, but also just trying to process it in a way that you can sort of like get it out of your body. Now, is that a healthy way to deal with it? Or is that actually just am I just adding to the problem in that instance?
Well, the idea is that whenever we experience a sort of stressor, so if we just rewind back to thousands of years ago, back in caveman days when life was a lot simpler, our stresses would typically be, a saber-toothed tiger comes in, our nervous system switches on, and we go into fight or flight. And we can either fight the saber-toothed tiger or run away. They're typically sort of the two main options. So when we're having today's stresses of, paying your bills, dealing with work, dealing with your boss, things like that, you can't really fight them, as much as you'd probably love to, and you can't really run away from your job either. So sometimes our nervous system is getting kind of switched on, and this is where we've basically got too much energy in the body. So your mind will go kind of too fast, you have faster heart rate, your body's kind of speeding up, and what needs to happen is we need to either be able to engage in some breaks, so engaging in our parasympathetic nervous system to kind of ease off some of that energy, or take some action, whatever relevant action is required. So because we've got that almost that nervous energy inside us, that's why sometimes people just busy, busy, busy. Like you said, you kind of taken all these sort of tasks, putting some, so you either want to do some action to kind of use that energy up, but also learn how to be able to switch off. Because otherwise, when you just use that system, you end up kind of burning out at some point. It's like if you've just got your foot on the accelerator all the time, your car's probably not going to, be very well functioning. At some point, it's probably going to sort of crash. So it's just learning to be flexible, learning when to put the accelerator on, and learning when to apply the brakes.
Yeah. And what are some of the ways that we can? I mean, I know there's some obvious ones, but what are some of the really good techniques that we can use to try and slow ourselves down, activate the parasympathetic nervous system, and actually allow ourselves to have a bit of that break from all the go, go, go that we can be invested in?
So the key to any kind of like mental health, whether it's anxiety, depression, things like that, is to kind of get out of our heads and get into our body. The only way we're going to signal safety is through the body, because when we're feeling stressed, when we're feeling anxious, your amygdala's firing up because it's detecting threat, and you're in a survival response. When you're in a survival response, your conscious, rational thinking brain is switched off, and this is your brain, which is creative, your ability to problem solve. So thinking is completely disconnected. So we can forget about thinking, and you kind of need to kind of just stop what you're doing, because a lot of times people get caught up in the anxiety, in the thoughts that they're having. You just want to sort of stop and just kind of go into your body. So I'm a somatic practitioner, so that means I use methods that work via the body. And when you work via the body, the body sends information to the brain to turn the amygdala to actually turn off. And this is how we return back to a sense of safety. So I use tools such as havening, which uses sensory touch. And when it applies sensory touch to areas such as your face, your upper arms, and your hands, what the guy that invented it, a sort of Dr. Ronald and Stephen Rudin, two brothers, they found it increases delta waves in your brain. So delta waves are the slowest brain waves that your brain produces. So you think anxiety is too much energy, and we're pretty much slowing the energy down to the point where your brain is at the super sort of slow. So it's literally like you're putting on the brakes. So it just kind of calms your nervous system down, but it's also a method that we use to heal trauma. And there's the way that it kind of works, it explains it all via neuroscience. So it does all kind of match in terms of the science. It's not like some therapies where it kind of sounds a little bit woo-woo. As much as crazy as it kind of sounds, and when I first come across havening, it was one of those things. It was like, oh, I'm not rubbing people's faces and arms. It's a bit kind of weird, blah blah blah.
Mm.
But success leaves clues, and it's probably one of my most successful kind of methods that I use. I also use breath work. I'm a breath work practitioner. I'm qualified in a number of different breath work techniques, and our breath is one of the easiest ways to change our nervous system states. So when we breathe in, we activate the sympathetic, and when we breathe out, we activate the parasympathetic. So a really sort of cool way to kind of regulate is, say for example, like now when I'm talking, I can extend the amount of breaths I speak or the amount of words I speak before I take a next in breath. So obviously I'm exaggerating just then, but doing that, like extending the words that you sort of say, will end up slowing your nervous system down because I'm breathing out before I take that next breath in. I'm just extending the exhale. So you can do it where, say, for example, if you are talking, that's how you can do it if you are kind of publicly speaking. It's a trick you can use. Or you can just kind of slow it down where, say, if you take a breath in and then slow down by kind of making a small opening of your mouth. But if you do that for as long as you can, and then even when you're finished with your breath, you can just pause at the bottom before you take that next breath in. So until you next take that breath in, you're still going to be putting on the brakes. And when we do this, it really slows the nervous system down. 75% of people that experience anxiety have dysregulated breathing patterns. I guarantee anybody that experiences chronic issues, so if you've got chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, depression, every single one of you will have dysregulated breathing patterns. So changing your breath is literally your life force. The more you can kind of learn to regulate your nervous system and regulate with your breath, the healthier your body will be. Your breath is literally your life force.
And this is such an amazing thing that I keep coming back to. Every time I have a conversation with somebody on the podcast, it's the simple things that can make the
Hmm.
biggest difference. And it's so shocking because it's almost like we've become out of tune with just those really simple things like our breath, like taking a moment, like going for a walk, the really little things that we can do, which are just part and parcel of like what we are as human beings. It's what we're supposed to be doing, but because our lives have become so just go 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 and fast and intertwined, we've forgotten like the basics, literally going back to the basics. And so we think things have to be hard. We think there's some complex solution to our problems. We've got to go finding those answers in like multiple places, or it's got to be this like long protocol that's going to take months and months and months. And actually just in starting to incorporate some deep breathing in the right way into your body, like do it a few times a day, or even start with once a day and then increase it, can make a huge difference to your health and your well-being and your mental health as well. When you work with people that sort of come to you for sort of anxiety, and you're using the different protocols that you use, what can be the biggest challenge to overcome in terms of their mindset or their beliefs about what they're suffering from?
The biggest obstacle is challenging somebody's beliefs. So, say for example, most people sort of come in. Most of the time, when I first speak to someone, they believe that there's something wrong with them because it's very taboo to even talk about kind of mental health, or social media is full of everyone that's winning every single day and living the best life and never having any bad days. So it's kind of like really disconnecting when you are having an experience where you feel like you're the only one having it. So a lot of people think there's something wrong with them, which absolutely isn't true. A lot of people think that they're kind of stuck like it, that nothing works, mostly because they've been to the doctors and they've been offered either drugs or CBT or talk therapy, which just isn't the right kind of therapy for anxiety if you actually understand how the brain works. And the third one is where people believe that they sort of can't change, or they have to believe that you have to be able to accept that you're wrong, which is a very big obstacle for a lot of people. So because of our belief systems, when we have our certain beliefs, we don't ever look to challenge them to check to see if they're wrong. We defend them, which is why there's such polarizing beliefs nowadays, where you pick a side and you have a certain belief. Now, very, very rarely will somebody be willing to challenge their beliefs, because if they prove themselves wrong, the shame, the kind of fear, and the kind of rejection that they may feel about being wrong is too much for them to handle. So it takes quite a lot for somebody's ego to be able to kind of actually try to test to see if they're wrong. And an example I can give you is that you could have this negative belief that that you're not good enough, or that you're an idiot or something like that, and you could do a million things all day long perfectly well, and you'll ignore all of that evidence that proves your belief wrong. But you get that one little thing wrong, or you do one little mistake, and you go, "Yep, see, I'm an idiot. Can't believe I did this. I'm such a failure," sort of thing, because it just reinforces the belief. We never look for proof to prove ourselves wrong, and this is where we have such polarizing kind of views nowadays, because nobody's kind of being able to kind of sit back in a state of safety and employ that logical, rational thinking, because their mind is so emotionally involved with their beliefs.
Yeah, and I think fear, as you mentioned, plays such a huge part in that, because there's fear in being able to, there's a way that fear affects our brains and doesn't allow us to see what we need to see, but there's also the fear of accepting, oh, maybe I am wrong. So could we just talk about like fear and how it affects the brain?
So to understand the brain, if you kind of think that we've got three brains essentially. We've got our thinking brain, which is like the logical, rational thought, which uses problem solving, creativity. That's what we call our kind of human brain. It's the newest part of our brain. Then we've got the mammalian brain, which all mammals have, which is called the emotional brain. And this is what is linked to our emotions. It's linked to kind of fear, it's pattern recognition, and how we kind of relate to human beings and how to relate to others. And the third part of our brain is the survival brain. It's what we call the reptilian brain, which is the oldest part of our brain. This is the brain stem. This is what creates or changes our autonomic functions. It's like our fight or flight, our survival responses. So to make it simple, you've got thinking, feeling, and survival. Now, when we are threatened or there's a perceived threat, and whether or not you kind of recognize it, we're all going through a massive trauma, a worldwide trauma. Fear kind of enters our brain, and when that happens, we take the low road, which is the fastest road. So the low road is where your amygdala kind of senses that there's danger, and then it automatically sends the body into kind of a fight or flight response, and your rational brain switched off. Now, most people's rational brains switched off, and when your brain's rational brain switched off and the critical thinking switched off, what do most people do? They look to authority, they look to their tribe, they look to other people to kind of get whatever their thoughts are because they aren't able to think. So we have a lot of kind of group think mentality. And when this is happening, we're so fearful of being rejected. We're so fearful of, being kicked out from the tribe because thousands of years ago, that would have meant instant death. If we didn't have the acceptance of our tribe members, we didn't have acceptance of our community, we wouldn't have survived. So when we say threat detection, it's not so much just a physical threat, but it's a threat to our identity, threat to our status, threat to our ego. These are all still threats. And this is what kind of triggers the amygdala to fire up to say, we're in danger, and we go into our automatic patterns. So we're not rationally thinking, we're not analyzing the information. We typically just blindly trust someone who we kind of has some authority, or we just go with whatever everyone else is doing. So imagine if you've got, 1,000 people in your tribe and your tribe's all doing one thing, you automatically follow that, which is why a lot of people, if you actually sat them down and asked them about what's going on in terms of taking the jab or anything like that, most people would actually kind of see, and like if I sat down with them, I can speak to them on a level where they wasn't feeling threatened and I was communicating very safely, I'd be able to engage them where they would be able to switch the fear off. And when you can engage in someone safely and there's no conflict, you can then engage someone's rational logical brain. But you do this by kind of asking questions instead of just telling someone. But most of what kind of discourse or communication that's happening online now is I'm saying this and you're saying that, and it's conflict. And as soon as your beliefs being challenged by the opposite enemy, that enemy that's perceived is a threat. So it just switches all the rational thinking brain off. And what we do is we go even deeper into our kind of beliefs that we've already made up. So we don't want to like to challenge our beliefs because then if we have to admit that we're wrong, it's a lot of people have so much overwhelming shame because they're not in tune with their emotions. We have so much suppressed and repressed kind of shame. It's too much for somebody to accept that they're wrong. So this is why a lot of times people aren't growing or people aren't making, I'm first when this will sort of come out, I was holding my breath walking past people. I was wearing masks before masks were even sold over here because I'm tuned into the world's news and sort of thing. So I was following everything in China. And I was, the girlfriend at the time I was having, I was kind of like telling her off for touching things in public. I was like, don't touch anything, do this. And I was in a state of fear.
Yeah.
But being able to kind of regulate my nervous system and over time, and as I calmed myself down and I could work through some of that fear, things started to kind of like prop up, but it didn't make any logical sense.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are saying this. There's some of the really public figures who are speaking out about this might not be safe, and we should critically think and we should question. Which I urge everybody always question things before you make a decision. That's part and parcel of our right as human beings, and also what we have to do to protect ourselves. But there's people saying, "Oh, but I don't understand why there's been a sudden change in thought." Because if you look at the beginning of the pandemic, these same people were saying, make sure you follow the advice, make sure you stay at home, make sure you wear your mask, make sure you sanitize your hands. But then a few months in, they've changed their tune and they're saying, actually, I'm not sure if this does add up. And I think there's this almost I don't know. I think there's almost like this misacceptance that once you state something, you've got to live and die by it for the rest of your life. Like there's no allowance for saying, actually, do you know what? I've had a look at this and I've actually reviewed this further and I've gone even deeper and I've tried to look for things to support it. And actually, something is just not adding up. And yes, so I am going to admit that maybe what I was saying before wasn't right because that's what I thought was right at the time. And now that I've got all this extra information that's come to light, I actually think we need to revisit this. I actually think we need to go back and look at this again. I actually urge all of you to do the same. And there's almost this thing where, once you say something, that's it. Like you cannot change your point of view. And oh, this used to be a person that used to believe this, and how have they changed? And it's like we've got to understand that the world is also changing. The world isn't static. We're not all living in a like confined environment that is like always the same. So as the world changes and as things come to light, we also have to change and adapt our thinking. And I think the only way we can really do that is to remain critically thinking, like remain open and keep our minds open to say, right, I'm just going to review this without emotion, like without taking my current beliefs and thoughts and all those things into account. And I'm just going to say, like, scientifically or mathematically or even just logically, do these things add up? And if they don't add up, am I brave enough and am I willing to actually question this? Like, am I going to just take a look at this and say, do you know what? I did follow all those things. I was the same as you. Like we got masked really early. We got all the sanitizers. We got all those things, and we did all of that stuff. And then as things came to light, it was like, actually, the survival rate of this thing is 99.99%. So what is it that we're doing all this stuff for? Like the flu, I have a higher risk of dying from the flu than I do of this. So how come I'm not taking the same precautions when it's flu season, right? Like we're walking around in flu season like it's all okay. So yeah, I think there is this sort of issue about being able to understand that you don't have to stay with a fixed opinion, and it is okay to change your thinking if something is presented to you that makes it valid for you to be able to change your perception of what's happening and just ask those questions. I guess, are there things that people can do to help to improve or allow themselves to be in a state where they can think more critically, where they can employ that critical thinking part of their brain?
Yes, so employing things like the breath work or the havening, we just kind of just switch your nervous system to a more kind of calm and regulated state. So we want to be in this kind of safe state where we feel connected to ourselves, we feel safe to be present and feel what we're feeling, where it doesn't overwhelm us, where we feel safe to be in our feelings. Now, most people learn certain emotions are very kind of big emotions. They're very overwhelming, and how we learnt them but maybe it wasn't so sort of safe. We didn't get the help to kind of teach our body that it's actually a safe thing. So what happens, we unconsciously avoid these kind of certain scenarios. So things like guilt, shame, anger, these are the big emotions. We will typically avoid situations which would trigger those emotions. So for the example, if I was to admit that I was wrong and I was actually, I've been kind of telling people and I've been arguing with people and I've been kind of shaming them. If I've been doing this sort of stuff and then I was actually recognize that I was wrong, the guilt and the shame would be so heavy that my brain would not even allow me to even explore it. So if somebody was working with me, I would get them to work through the guilt and shame. That the guilt and shame can be connected to anything. We all have different tanks of emotions. So imagine you've got this tank of guilt, tank of shame, tank of anger in your body. When you have a build-up of that, so every single time you've experienced it, if you've not expressed it and you've not felt 100% safe and comfortable just to be with it, it will just build up in your system. And that's when, say, for example, if you do experience any of it, you experience it in a disproportionate response to maybe what's going on in that moment. So you go from 0 to 100. There's times in the past where, somebody would pull out in front of me in my car and I'd want to jump out and fight the guy, which is crazy. Like, I don't even care now. Someone pulls out in front of me, I'm like, all right, you're an idiot. You can't drive, obviously. But I just get on with my life. But before, I must have had such a build-up of anger. It was just waiting to trigger. Now, a lot of times people are just living life like that. And this is why we disconnect from our feelings and from our emotions. So the more someone can kind of be of themselves, practice any embodied practice, things like yoga, exercise, meditation, breath work, anything where we're just kind of in our bodies and slowing down will allow us to then create some space. And when we can create some space, we can then think and analyze the information without it kind of triggering. Because when it triggers our brain, we go in back into our default responses. We're not kind of thinking with our adult brain. We're thinking with our mammalian brain, or kind of like reptilian brains, where it's all geared for survival. And when it's geared for survival, we're not looking at the bigger picture. So for most people, if you could practice a practice which gets you into your body, where you're doing, say, for example, some havening or some breath work, or even things like yoga, all of that sort of stuff will calm your body down. Which is, why a lot of yoga teachers and stuff like that are speaking up about this sort of stuff, because they're very in tune with their bodies. They're very in touch with their emotions and their intuition. They feel comfortable within themselves and feel comfortable sort of standing out and being the black sheep to be going, hang on a minute, the data and the evidence doesn't quite support what's actually happening. How about we just slow down for a minute and just look at the information? So that's always what I implore people to do, just to actually look at the information, or you're looking purely based on the facts and the evidence, not anything emotionally involved. But the problem is what the media is constantly, it is essentially propaganda. And if you understand NLP, I know you understand hypnotherapy, you understand hypnosis, you can see all the hypnotic language patterns people are doing. You can see the repetition, repetition, repetition. I can't even drive from here to wherever I'm going without the radio. It's on the radio, it's on the signpost. People don't understand that all of this information is going into your brain. And the fact that it's going on and we have this social compliance because we just trust if everybody else is doing it, it must be okay. We always kind of believe that we're living in the best of the world, or the best version of the world that could possibly be. And we feel like this is the way that we've always done things. So we must be living the best version of the world. But it often isn't the case. Things could be better. And people are just too caught up in their own feelings and their emotions. And especially where, say, for example, if somebody has lost anybody, they go, oh, you don't know because you've not lost anyone, blah, blah. As soon as anybody says that, they're speaking from an emotional perspective. So they're seeing through things through an emotional lens. And as soon as they're doing that, their rational brain switched off and they can't see things logically. And because people are scared, understandably, I'm terrified. I go through states of despair and hope, cycling around constantly. It is very overwhelming. It's too hard. It actually takes too much of your brain to actually sit there and actually analyze this information, and then to stand up and then express yourself or be the black sheep and basically be, shunned from society essentially, because that's how they're framing it, is way too much for most people to accept on a nervous system state and an ego state as well.
Yeah, and I can totally relate to that because just like when you first come across these bits of evidence, you don't want to believe it, right? You're sort of in denial, just like, oh, maybe that's just one thing. And then something else crops up, and then another thing crops up. And then when you start piecing these bits of information together, it's like, I'm an educated individual, and this data and everything that's coming together, it doesn't make sense. And all my life I've been taught to think critically, and I empower children to do that. That's my mission in life, is to help children think critically and empower them to question things that don't make sense. So how can I then not question stuff that is like glaring at me in the face and doesn't feel right? But you go through all these motions. You go through denial, then you go through despair, then you go through anger, then you go through you go through all those motions, and then you have to get to a point where you come to, okay, acceptance. Like, I don't like this. This might be happening. And even if I'm wrong, even if there's a chance I'm wrong, and I would be the happiest person in the world if I was wrong, right? What can I do? Like, what action can I take? How can I? And as I said, I always go to action because for me, that's the best way for me to take my energy and put it into something productive. What steps or what action, however little or however small, whatever my life allows for me to take, can I do to come to this conversation and try and learn more, educate myself further, not take things at face value, and then provide support to all the other people who are taking the action and all the other people that are doing the good things that need to be done, to be able to just question this. No one's saying that it doesn't have to be aggressive, it doesn't have to be negative, it doesn't have to be like standoffish, and we just need to ask the questions. It's just about asking those questions. And that really brings me to why, and that is for our children, right? This is about our children. This is not so much about us. Like, as adults, we have the freedom to make those decisions, and we can read the text and we can sort of come up with our things. And I appreciate and respect everybody's decision, whichever way they decide to go. But when it comes to our children, we're talking about 12, 13-year olds. They can't drive yet, they can't drink alcohol yet, they can't consent for lots of other things. How are they supposed to make informed decisions in a time when they can't actually get their heads around the information, and when most of us as adults are struggling to get our heads around actually what is the truth and what is the information. So as we're talking about children, they've had a year which is unprecedented, that no one could have prepared them for, that many of us were not prepared for. What are some of the tools and techniques, or does it differ with children compared to adults, or can some of the things you've talked about also be applied to help our children as well deal with this particular time of pressure and anxiety?
Well, children are even more influential or influenced, sorry, because your prefrontal cortex, your thinking brain, doesn't actually evolve or fully mature to the age of 25. So they're mostly, if you're under the age of sort of 7 or 8, you're purely subconscious. You're purely in that kind of limbic system brain where you're just in your patterns, and their brains are like sponges. But in terms of being able to kind of regulate them, it's the same thing: touch and regulating yourself. So if you can stay regulated yourself, but a lot of people don't recognize that most communication is non-verbal. So when it's non-verbal, it's through our body language, but most of it is through our facial expressions. It's through our facial expressions, our tonality, the way that our kind of voice, the patterns of the voice, the change in the pitch. That's why kids start singing songs. Or they love the little sing songs. They love people that, they just nursery rhymes sort of things. Kids sort of love that, and it actually engages them to actually kind of feel some level of safety. So the best thing you could probably do for your children is learn how to regulate yourself. The amount of clients that I've had where they've messaged me saying that the kids have got anxiety, blah blah blah. I'm like, well, your kid's nervous system is mirroring your nervous system. So the best thing you could possibly do is create safety within yourself, because they may not consciously recognize it, but if they're feeling a little bit scared, and then mum and dad are completely feeling safe and engaged, they'll go, oh, their nervous system's safe. Maybe I can be okay. And it's the same concept when I'm working with my clients. When for clients working with some big emotions or some traumas that, is very overwhelming, and their body is literally screaming at them saying, danger, danger, we are not safe. If I can stay completely safe and I can keep myself regulated, they might not exit it consciously, but their body is going, huh, this is a bit weird. He feels completely safe. Maybe we can be safe with this. Maybe we can safe be with this this experience that we're having. Whereas a lot of kind of, say for example, if you was to tell your deepest, darkest traumas to a friend or someone who cares about you, what happen is they will often get upset because they care about you, because they love you. And essentially what's happening in those moments is saying, I don't feel okay, they don't feel okay, so it's good that I'm not okay, because that's what the general acceptance is from a social acceptance level.
Mm.
So the best thing you can do for your child is literally help yourself and engage in these kind of practices. But it is a practice. It is something that you want to do when you don't need it. A lot of times people are waiting for it and go, oh, I'll do it, once I'm really, really sort of stressed. But by that point, you're so in your mammal brain rather than your adult conscious brain that everything you've learned goes out of the window. So you want to just build up those practices. So imagine it's kind of like emptying out your tank. Imagine you've got a stress tank that builds up every day. You don't want to sort of wait till it starts overflowing, because if it's overflowing, that tank's going to be so heavy to kind of pick up and spill out. You're going to get the stress water everywhere. Versus if you just notice it kind of filling up a little bit and you go, oh, and just empty that out, and you just feel so much better. You won't recognize that you're feeling stressed, but every single time you do something like that after, you go, oh, you know what? I didn't recognize how I was feeling, but I actually feel so much more calmer. I actually feel so much more relaxed than I did before. And when we can just regulate that and just build that into our daily practice, that's kind of like where we need to be. But life's so stressful nowadays, where we're taking on so much sort of activities, we're doing so much, we're being bombarded with information. All of that is stimulatory. So whether it's consuming food, which is energy, consuming breath by over breathing, consuming information, which is going into your brain, all these things we're over consuming, and it's overwhelming for us. So it's learning to actually just be able to kind of keep ourselves regulated, empty out our cup, manage our consumption. So manage the information that we're receiving. If the news is terrifying you, don't watch the news. If social media is annoying you because it looks like everyone else is living their best life and it's making you feel insecure, stay off social media. A lot of times we need to take responsibility for ourselves, and the more we can take responsibility for ourselves rather than this idea that we're taking care of everyone else, then that's how the world kind of changes. So in terms of looking after your kids, the best thing you can do is look after yourself, but applying havening touch. So for example, cuddling, stroking the arms, stroking the face will calm them down. But at the same time, if they are feeling sort of stressed, if you just go, oh, let's do it together. So, say for example, we're sitting here, we're stroking our face, we would notice that, say for example, my nervous system would calm down, and because we've got mirror neurons, if I just kind of done this, if I started to relax, your body would start to relax too without you even doing anything. So, again, the best thing you can do is essentially take care of yourself.
That is such amazing advice. And I know people say it all the time, like put on your oxygen mask first, or, make sure you look after yourself first. But I think the way you've explained that is just very eye-opening, because it really gives a justification for why you need to do it for
Mm.
yourself first. And I think as a parent, you struggle with this all the time. And sometimes you think you're doing a really good job of masking your fear or masking your anxiety, right? Like in front
Yeah.
in front of my kids, I'm like, oh, everything's fine, like everything's okay, let's go do this thing. But children can feel your energy. Like no matter how happy or how
Mm.
okay you seem to be to your children, if you have a stressful day, like my daughter the other day came up to me and she was like, Mommy, are you okay? I'm like, yeah, I'm fine. I'm trying to do 500 things, and things are going through my mind, and I'm just like worrying about stuff. And she brought me her poppet. So these little toys that all these kids have in school now, where you just like press the thing. And she goes, "Oh, by the way, this is a stress toy. It will really help you. You should you should try pressing the buttons on the pipette." And I was like, "Oh, thank you so much." And then it obviously made me realize that she can sense my stress no matter how okay I say I am. And so it's not about pretending you're okay or masking that you're okay. It's actually about being okay. And so I had to like take a step back, like close my laptop and say to her, do you know what, I'm going to go and do some meditation, do you want to come with me? And so we just both went into the room and like put the candles on and then just sit together and just do some meditation together, because I need her to see that when I've either realized I'm stressed or she has pointed out to me that I'm stressed, that I'm doing something about it. I'm not just working through it, I'm not just pretending to plow through it as I normally would have done. I'm actually showing her, do you know what, I've just recognized, and you've just helped me recognize that I'm not feeling the best. Let's go do something about it, and you can help me. Let's do it together. And so I found that has really empowered my children, that it's okay to not be okay in front of your children. I don't think you
Mm.
have to mask your feelings or pretend like the world is a happy place, and it's okay, because at the moment it doesn't always feel like that. Um,
No.
but it's important for your children to understand that there are things we can do though to help us get back to like center ourselves, or there's things that you can actually help me do, and that actually empowers my children, because then they're like, oh, I can help my mommy and daddy if they're not feeling their best, or I can point it out to them. And so I think my kids, especially over the last year, have become better and better at telling me, like, you look a bit stressed, or you're sounding a bit stressed, or you're acting a bit stressed. And it's actually been really great for me, because I'm not always very good at catching it myself. Do you have any tips on how we can start to figure out what our stress signals might be? Because like you say, it might not be this manic crazy spiral of thoughts. It can be like just being busy, or just being just doing other things. Is there a way for us to be able to sort of catch and understand our stress signals a bit earlier, so that we can stop and actually deal with them, like empty the bucket, as you say?
I will definitely jump on that, but I'd love to jump on what you're sort of saying with
Oh
with your
yes.
children, because it comes up so often, where my clients say to me, I don't ever let my kids see me upset. I try to make sure that that they never see me kind of stressing and worrying, but it disempowers them, because, like you mentioned, your kids are way smarter than you, in terms of they're more in tune with their feelings, because when we're born, we're just very much in our emotions. We haven't developed that thinking aspect, that logical rational brain where we're kind of always in our head and our thoughts. It doesn't exist. So for kids, if they're sad, they're crying their eyes out. It's the worst thing in the world. If they're angry, it's the biggest tantrum in the world, sort of thing. If they're happy, it's the best thing in the world, sort of thing. They're very much intuitive into their emotions. And what we want to learn, and how what we actually want to teach our children, is emotional regulation. So our vagus nerve is our ability to kind of create a sense of safety, and that's what we kind of connect with our bodies. And your children will inherit typically the mother's vagus nerve, and it will learn this through attunement. So if you're attuned to yourself, the idea is that you'd be attuned to your children, and you will notice when they're not feeling a certain way, and then you will regulate them. And it's the same way with yourself, because we don't recognize that children don't copy what you do. Sorry, they don't copy what you say, they copy what you do. It's all
Yeah.
patterns. So a lot of times you may even notice, a lot of parents may be kind of watching this or listening to this, where they think, oh yeah, so sometimes my kids come out with certain phrases that, like, oh my God, they've heard me kind of say that.
Yeah.
So we emulate through our mirror neurons. This is how we kind of learn how to be adults, essentially. So the best thing you could do is allow your children to see, yes, these emotions are normal. And when you allow yourself to be expressive and you allow yourself to feel what you feel, it's completely okay. But then this is how we then take care of it. We want to normalize our emotions. We don't want to hide them, because then we just learn that it's something that we suppress and we hide away from, which generally leads to mental health issues such as anxiety and depression. Um, just remind me what you did ask after that. How to recognize when you are feeling overwhelmed. So, um, this is a great topic as well, because I, even personally myself, I don't recognize when I'm feeling sort of stressed. But what you might recognize is your behaviors. So everybody has their own sort of behaviors, their kind of stress behaviors. So, for example, these are typically things that we use to either distract ourselves or numb ourselves. So these are all ways that our subconscious, our amazing subconscious, or our body, however you want to imagine it, is trying to make ourselves feel better. So for me, I know that I scroll on social media, and I'll be sitting there and I'll be almost like brain dead, almost like I'm not actually kind of taking it in. I'm not enjoying it even. I'm sitting there and I'm like, what am I doing? I'm just scrolling. So I can catch myself scrolling sometimes. I'll either be trying to look in the cupboards in the kitchen. So I'll be looking for food when I'm not hungry. So that's a behavior I notice when I'm trying to self-soothe. Um, Sometimes I'll be looking for attention from the opposite sex. We have all of these kind of patterns, and if we're just really honest to ourselves and compassionate, so in terms of we're not judging ourselves, you will notice that you have certain patterns of behavior which you use or your body's trying to use to self-soothe. So if you don't recognize how you're feeling all the time, because sometimes we're disconnected from our body and disconnected from our emotions, recognize your other patterns. So what are your kind of coping strategies? What does your mind start doing? Are you looping? Are you thinking about a certain thing over and over and over again? Are you distracting yourselves through TV, or social media, or these apps, or whatever you're doing? Are you trying to numb yourself with drink, drugs, food? Are you trying to distract yourself with shopping? All of these things. It's not to shame anyone, but it's to recognize that your amazing body is trying to help you. And it's not the best strategy to use, but the best thing to do is when you can observe yourself, when you're the observer, you engage your rational thinking brain. So when you can observe without any judgment, because when we apply judgment, we apply shame. And we apply shame, lights up the amygdala, get pulled out of your rational thinking brain and back into the survival responses again. So the key is to remain observational, to be able to observe our behaviors and responses. And most of the time, you're more likely to recognize your behavior than you are how you feel. As soon as you start recognizing your behavior, that's when you can go, just like you mentioned, maybe it's time I then take responsibility for myself and take action and maybe do something that makes me feel good. Whether it's running yourself a bath, giving yourself a half an hour break from whatever you're doing, um, doing some exercise, moving your body, doing some yoga, some breath work, some meditation, anything where you just kind of just consciously taking the time to just take time out for yourself and just go into that rest mode. That's the key. Literally just observing yourself and taking some responsibility for how you feel.
Thank you. I think there's some amazing actions that anyone listening to this can go and take and do what Shane said, do observe yourself without that judgment. It can be a really hard thing to do because judgment is sort of like, it's almost like a human behavior. Like it's tuned into us and we sort of judge everything around us. But just detach from the judgment because you're the only person observing yourself. Like nobody else needs to know about what's happening, and just start making a list of, these are the things I start to do when I spiral into this particular mode, or this is what I start to do when I start to feel really stressed, or this is what I do when I feel anxious. And I think as you learn your own behavior, or ask the people around you, like I have very good canaries that signal to me when I'm acting stressed now with my kids. Ask the people around you who love you to sort of help you to identify when that's happening so you can catch it earlier and earlier. Like you can rely on the people around you to say, oh, I think you're feeling a little bit off, maybe you want to go take a break, or I think you should go and like run yourself a bath and take a time out. Like it's always good to also look out for the people around you and pick up what their signals are as well, because like you say, it's really hard to spot them for yourself,
It
especially, sorry, go ahead.
that would save most marriages and relationships.
Yeah.
Because when you're communicating emotionally, you're in conflict, you're being very defensive, you're not going to be very open, you're not going to be able to see things from a different perspective. So the idea is if you had a system with your partner where you could maybe do a certain signal where I'm recognizing that either I'm feeling stressed or maybe you're feeling stressed, and you just
Yeah.
go, okay, let's just both maybe sort of regulate with ourselves. So if you both sat there and just go, let me just notice what we're feeling, and maybe we're just doing some havening, maybe we're calming our body down. And once we feel a bit calmer, we engage. If we can't engage without emotion, you're going to have conflict and you're going to just keep arguing and arguing and arguing. And ideally, you have to be an adult about these things and have to recognize that you're not the best person when you're in your emotional states. I know I certainly aren't. I've ruined relationships. The last relationship that I was kind of in, that pretty much ended because of emotional kind of triggers. If I could catch myself, and even with everything that I know, with everything that I do, when you are triggered to that degree, it's very hard to catch yourself in that moment.
Yeah.
It's because you're almost pressing play on your automatic defense patterns, and you're just going very defensive, and you may defend yourself through anger and through expressing and through attacking sometimes, or you may kind of just even shut down and you don't communicate and you kind of stonewall people. Whatever we do when we're in those defensive states, we have to recognize, I'm going into a very defensive response. I can't engage in this moment. I need to take responsibility. I need to regulate. I need to calm my body down. And when I feel more resourceful, then we can engage. Because otherwise, it's never going to have a positive outcome. It's
Yeah.
generally going to make things worse.
It just won't be a productive conversation.
Yeah.
So I would apply that very same tactic to relationships as well. Like, people do have very opposing views on different topics at the moment. And so if you're finding with loved ones, you're not able to have that productive conversation, then just think about, am I coming to this with emotion? Is there too much
Hmm.
emotion triggering this conversation? And if that is the case, then like take a step back and think about, like, is this relationship worth sacrificing for this particular issue? And if you feel that strongly, and in some cases maybe it is, then obviously that's a choice. But if you're thinking actually this relationship is really important and we may have differing views, but we just both need to take a step back and come again to this conversation without the emotion, regulate yourself first, and you'll be able to come to it with a much more productive point of view. I have people in my circle who agree and who disagree on various aspects of things that I share or say, but at all the time we're able to maintain respectful conversation about the topic. It's like, I still respect you, I still have love for you, I still am very open to your right to believe whatever you believe and whatever you feel, but I just ask that you do the same for me as well, that I'm allowed to share what I feel and what I believe as well. So I think that's a really productive point for us to actually end this episode on. But do you have any last words of action or wisdom that you'd like to leave the audience with before we end the episode today?
Just for people to just spend time with themselves, to just be brutally honest with yourself, to just be with your feelings, comfort yourself, and just build a relationship with yourself. If you can have a better relationship with yourself, you'll have a better relationship with everyone else. That means taking responsibility for how you feel, taking responsibility for your life, taking responsibility for your health. When you start taking radical responsibility for yourself, your whole life will change. And it's very hard. It's very easy to just be ignorant and point fingers and blame everyone else. But you're going to remain an eternal victim to life. So the more you can kind of take responsibility for yourself, and be open to maybe sort of challenge yourself, because the only way you're ever going to grow is by being wrong. Nobody learned anything by being right all the time. And when you can accept that kind of growth mindset, you're always going to win, because if you're getting better, you're always improving. It doesn't matter if I'm wrong, I love it, because it means I get to grow. I get to be a better version of me. So if everybody could just focus on just being better versions of themselves rather than being right, I think the world would be a better place.
Definitely, there's no shame in ever being
Yeah,
wrong, because it just means you've learned something new, and that's
that's it.
amazing. That's amazing. Thank you so much, Shane. If you'd like to hear more from Shane or learn more from him, then his links will be in the episode show notes. So do be sure to check them out and connect with him. And for more episodes of the Back to Health podcast, you can also catch those links in the episode show notes. Thank you so much for listening. And if you've had any takeaways or any actions that you're going to follow up from after this episode, please also share those in the comments. We'll be back very soon with another episode. Thank you for listening. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you would like any of the links or the show notes, you can follow them in the description below. And for more episodes of the Back to Health podcast, please be sure to follow us on YouTube, or you can follow us on Spreaker, where we host our podcast. Thanks again, and I look forward to joining you for another episode of the Back to Health podcast. Until then, stay healthy, stay happy, and stay informed.